Hello, my friend. It's good to have you back with me again. Picture a man leaning against the railing of a ship, somewhere in the middle of a gray, restless ocean. And inside the bag sits a golden statuette that weighs barely more than a bag of sugar. Nobody forced him to carry it across an ocean. Nobody on the far shore is even entirely sure he's coming. Most of his colleagues back home think the whole voyage is a waste of time and money. But the man is smiling, quietly, to himself, because he believes in something most people around him simply can't yet see. Today we're going to follow the story of a game. Not just any game, but the one that some 6 billion human beings now watch together every 4 years. The game a barefoot teenager once practiced with a grapefruit stuffed inside a sock. The man on that ship was named Jules Rimet, president of FIFA, and he was crossing the Atlantic toward Uruguay to watch something the world had never seen before. Rimet had spent months practically begging the continent's football federations to make the trip. He'd written letter after letter. He'd made phone call after phone call. The Great Depression had just begun tearing through economies on both sides of the Atlantic, and money for a football tournament on the other side of the world felt. He had no evidence for this. He simply believed it, the way people sometimes believe the things that later turn out to reshape history. But where did this game actually come from in the first place? On a modest patch of grass in Glasgow. Two teams walked out that day, one in dark blue, the other in white. England against Scotland. Around 4,000 spectators showed up to watch. Nobody scored a single goal. From there, the game simply spread, the way fire spreads through dry grass. From Britain into continental Europe. From Europe across the Atlantic into South America. By the 1920s, football had found its way into the Olympic Games, and at the 1924 Paris Olympics, a small South American nation walked onto the pitch that almost nobody in Europe had bothered to take seriously beforehand. Uruguay arrived with no reputation to speak of. Almost helplessly, into applause, Uruguay won gold. For years later, in Amsterdam, they won gold again. Europe, for lack of a better word, was rattled. Something that belonged to the sport alone rather than to a broader athletic movement it merely shared a stadium with. The vote passed. The World Cup, at least on paper, was born. 2 years later came the ship, the gray ocean, the small golden trophy zipped inside a travel bag, and Jules Rimet, quietly smiling, sailing toward a dream that could still have collapsed at any moment. The very first World Cup nearly didn't happen at all. England said no. Germany said no. In the end, only 4 European nations agreed to make the crossing: France, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Romania, whose squad, remarkably, was handpicked in part by the country's own king. Carol II reportedly read through the list of available players himself and personally decided who would represent, assemble a cabinet. And though his name has largely faded from casual football conversation today, it's permanently fixed into the record books as the answer to one of the sport's oldest trivia questions. Uruguay went on to beat Argentina 4-2 in the final, in front of roughly 93,000 spectators. And Jules Rimet walked out onto the pitch himself to hand the trophy to Uruguay's captain, grinning the whole way. His improbable idea had actually worked. But the deeper lesson of that first tournament had very little to do with who actually lifted the trophy. 20 years later, the world would learn that particular lesson in about as dramatic a fashion as football has ever managed to produce. Uruguay won 2-1, and something close to 200,000 people fell utterly silent in the very same instant. A silence that reportedly rippled outward across the entire country within hours. It's still remembered today as the Maracanazo, the Great Maracana Shock. The tournament kept expanding and kept writing new chapters every 4 years. But in 1958, one particular chapter changed the entire trajectory of the sport. A 17-year-old boy boarded a plane bound for Sweden. He'd grown up with almost nothing, practicing with a ball fashioned out of a grapefruit stuffed inside an old sock, because a real leather football was simply beyond his family's means. His father had once played the game professionally without ever quite breaking through, and the boy had quietly promised himself from a very young age. After the final whistle, Pele reportedly collapsed onto the pitch in tears, and teammates had to help carry him off. He was 17 years old, and already, by most reasonable measures, the finest footballer alive. At the 1962 tournament, Pele was injured early and unable to continue, and most teams robbed of their single greatest asset. His name was Manuel Francisco dos Santos, though almost everyone simply called him Garincha, Little Bird. His right leg curved outward. Doctors at the time reportedly told his family he would never run properly at all, playing with a kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that suggested football wasn't simply his profession. It was, quite literally. Then came 1970, in Mexico, under brutal heat and on pitches baked dry by the sun, and Brazil arrived with a version of the game the rest of the world had genuinely never encountered before. Pele was back. The final against Italy finished 4-1, and the fourth goal has since become something close to sacred in football folklore. It's still routinely described as the greatest team goal in World Cup history. The trophy itself, the Jules Rimet Trophy, named after the very man who'd once carried it across the Atlantic in a travel bag, was awarded permanently to Brazil, the first and only nation to win it 3 separate times. The world, watching, finally settled on a name for whatever it was Brazil had just shown everyone: Jogo Bonito. In 1946, there was no World Cup either. The Second World War had swallowed the globe whole. Stadiums were repurposed as military installations. Players who might otherwise have been scoring goals were instead being handed rifles. Jules Rimet's dream sat frozen, indefinitely, somewhere between memory and hope, and the physical trophy itself was, for a time, in genuine danger. When German forces occupied Rome, a FIFA vice president named Ottorino Barassi made a quiet decision that history has since treated almost like a small act of heroism. He walked into FIFA's offices, retrieved the actual Jules Rimet trophy, wrapped it carefully in an old cloth, placed it inside an unremarkable shoebox. One man's private, stubborn conviction that it would eventually matter again. He turned out to be entirely right. In 1950, the World Cup returned to the calendar. Then a dog named Pickles, out for an ordinary walk with his owner in a South London garden, began sniffing insistently at something buried beneath a hedge. Underneath, it was a package wrapped in old newspaper. Inside that package sat the missing Jules Rimet trophy, and was even given a small taste of celebrity dog food as a reward. The tournament went ahead as planned, and still, through both episodes, the tournament survived intact, because the World Cup was never really a building, or a physical trophy, or even an organization with an office address. At the 1966 tournament in England, every African football federation collectively boycotted the competition. Their message, delivered collectively and unmistakably, was simple: we exist, and we refuse to be treated as an afterthought. The protest worked. From 1970 onward, Africa was guaranteed its own dedicated qualifying places. In 1982, the tournament expanded again to 24 teams, opening room for more nations and, inevitably, more stories nobody had gotten to tell yet. An entire generation of American children grew up watching those matches, and many of them would go on, years later, to help build one of the more financially significant football leagues anywhere in the world. In 2002, South Korea and Japan co-hosted the tournament together, and Asia finally got a World Cup it could genuinely call its own. In 2010, For the very first time in the competition's history, the tournament arrived on African soil in South Africa and the steady. It wasn't simply a football tournament anymore. It was an entire continent standing up and saying, unmistakably, "We are here, and this game belongs to us too." They reached the semifinals, the first African team in the entire history of the tournament to do so. They spread across Senegal, across Nigeria, across Egypt, rippling outward across almost the entire continent at once. Whose mother had spent years cleaning houses across the Spanish capital so that her son might one day have opportunities she never had herself. For the first time in the tournament's history, the World Cup will be jointly hosted across three separate nations at once: the United States, Mexico, and Canada. 16 host cities will open their gates, 11 across the United States, 3 in Mexico, spread between Guadalajara, Mexico City, and Monterrey, and 2 in Canada. On the 11th of June, a referee standing somewhere inside a packed stadium in Mexico City will lift a whistle to his lips, and 48 national squads, having traveled from virtually every corner of the inhabited planet, will finally take the field. Some will arrive as genuine favorites. Most, if we're honest, will arrive simply as dreamers with very little to lose, sometimes surrounded by family, sometimes standing shoulder to shoulder with total strangers who become something like old friends for exactly 90 minutes. They'll speak thousands of different languages between them, coming from cultures that, on paper, share almost nothing in common at all. And yet, at the precise moment that first whistle sounds, every single one of them will understand exactly what's happening without needing a single word of translation. Think, for a moment, back to Jules Rimet, standing on the deck of that ship in 1930, a small golden trophy zipped inside a travel bag under his arm, largely in proven belief that football could become a language the entire world might eventually come to share, and that when nations met each other honestly on a football pitch, something between them softened, even if only slightly, even if only for 90 minutes at a time. He had no real proof any of that was true. He simply believed it anyway. In that time, his original idea has survived 2 world wars, countless political upheavals, and more or less every kind of catastrophe the modern world has managed to invent. The trophy sits, quite literally, at the center of the world, watched over by roughly 6 billion pairs of eyes, waiting to be lifted, once again, by a captain from a nation that might very well surprise absolutely everyone. It usually does. That, in the end, has always been the entire point. And you, my friend, maybe you know this particular feeling too. The quiet weight of carrying something forward. An idea, a hope, a private conviction in something other people simply can't see yet. Maybe someone has already told you it sounds a little crazy. Maybe the road ahead of you looks uncomfortably long, like an ocean crossing, like 2 full weeks aboard a ship with absolutely no guarantee of what's actually waiting on the other side. Jules Rimet had no idea, back in 1930, what his small, stubborn idea would eventually become. He simply kept going anyway. The World Cup, in the end, belongs to everyone. It belongs to a barefoot teenager who once practiced with a grapefruit stuffed inside a sock. It belongs to a little bird with curved legs who learned to fly anyway. It belongs to a man who once hid a golden trophy inside a shoebox and checked on it faithfully every single night for 3 long years.